Let's make this interactive, and we can all talk and ask questions as we go along. There are a number of issues that I see that come up a lot in research, and this is mostly when I'm functioning as a reviewer. So I see the same mistakes being made so repeatedly that it is become a little frustrating to me. And I've embarked on a campaign that whenever I can to try and stop this. And I think the source, the biggest single source, there's two things that I want to talk about, but the first one, the biggest single source of problems is this idea that what you want to do is to fill a research gap, that this is what you're looking to do. I think this idea, while not completely incorrect, excuse me, while not completely incorrect, leads people very far astray and causes a lot of problems. And what I would recommend instead is that you think about building on past work as a more appropriate way to frame your research. So filling a research gap, what that really amounts to is picking a new topic, finding a topic that other people have not written about before and writing about a new topic. So I'm going to use a metaphor of creating a city or building buildings. And in this metaphor, filling a research gap is saying, I'm laying the foundation for a building, for a new building. So I've dug a hole in the earth and I've poured in the concrete, right? Building on past work says, I'm building the fourth floor on a building that already has 3 stories. So I'm finding something else that's already in process, and I'm adding one more layer to that. How do you know, when you're reading something, how do you know that they've taken this filling a research gap approach? And that is that the literature review lists the topics of past papers, but doesn't say what those past papers found in any detail. So you'll pick up the paper, you start reading it, and immediately it'll be so-and-so, people have talked about this, so-and-so said, and people have talked about that, and they talked about this other thing. And then it goes on to something else, right? But if you want to understand any of those topics, you don't get any understanding of those topics because that's not the point. The point is just to list the topic itself. Whereas in the approach of building on past work, the literature review includes an in-depth look at maybe 1 to 3 different past papers. And it talks in detail about what the findings were for these past papers. The problem with, there's numerous problems with filling a research gap approach. But one of the main problems is that it encourages people to find ever smaller and less important topics to talk about. So when you found if you're determined to find a new topic, then what you end up doing is very frequently, sometimes I should say, sometimes that's totally fine. Sometimes you find a new topic that is tremendously important. And this happens a lot, for example, if there's a new technological change, right? So we have AI stuff. There are a lot of topics related to artificial intelligence that are very important that people haven't really worked on yet because it's new or pretty new. So there are times when you will be able to find something important, but that's really much more the exception than the rule. What you find mostly is that when you do this approach, a lot of the important topics have already been written on to some degree. And the only way to find something new that nobody's ever talked about is to find something extremely small and very particular. And so you start to do this. Or if that becomes difficult, there's a couple of cheats that people use. One is, I'm the first person in this discipline to write about this. So you take something that's widely done in some other discipline, and there are actually times when papers like that can be useful. So if there is a topic that's relevant to one discipline and it's really been written on extensively in another, you could do a literature review that, you know, says like, hey, we should be paying attention to this. Here's a whole bunch of really good literature. Here's what they found. Here's how it's relevant to us, right? So that would be a fine type of paper. But that's not what people do. They say, you know, I'm writing in discipline X and nobody's talked about this in discipline X, and therefore we can ignore all of the things that's been done in discipline Y, just pretend they don't exist and write a new paper, you know, write this paper and it'll be the first in this. Or they find some other context. So you see this a lot in tourism and hotel management, where they'll say people have done this for, you know, other types of services, but restaurants, but nobody's done it for hotels, right? And then they'll publish in the hotel management book. And again, that's not completely wrong. There are times I think that that could be useful, but it tends not to be done in the most useful way. So the two major symptoms of this are literature reviews that don't really talk about past findings. And that's because they don't want to build on past findings. They want to pretend there are no past findings. And then finding ever tinier things to write about as a result. What you get if you take the other approach is much more collective progress. Someone lays a foundation and they build one story and another story and another story, and you actually get someplace. That I think is the biggest advantage. And how my views about this have been changed somewhat due to what's called the replication crisis. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but just to refresh your memory, there's an expanding literature of attempts to take important papers in the social sciences and just do a strict replication of them. And it turns out that many of them don't replicate. And I have also, more important in my mind than that, is that I look at literatures that I'm familiar with. Let's say, for example, the relationship between income and happiness that I've written about pretty extensively. That's one of the most widely researched topics in the social sciences. There are so many papers on this topic. And for a long time, there was this view that there was, in terms of the R-squared, almost no relationship between income and happiness. And there were probably hundreds of studies pointing this out. And all of those studies said, you know, we expect this to be a curvilinear relationship, some sort of diminishing marginal returns. But we're going to use linear regression or some other type of linear approach to model it. And then an economist at the University of Michigan, Wolfers, and some of his colleagues come along and say, actually, let's not use a linear regression. Let's use a curvilinear. We expect this to be, you know, log linear related. Let's use log-based data to get a curvilinear approach. And all of a sudden, the R-squared pops up quite dramatically. Now, the actual findings are more complicated, and then this gets oversold in the other direction, and things are, you know, tough. But what was important to me about this is that people had published like over 100 studies in all sorts of different contexts before someone came along and said, you know, we're all doing this wrong here. we need to do this in a slightly different way. And it was a fairly obvious way. And so what I've noticed now that I'm an old person and have had a chance to watch this thing happen is you don't actually know what's going on in the field until you reach this sort of third stage. So the first thing that happens is someone writes a paper or two that have some very interesting, provocative finding. Then other people want to build on that, and so they put out a bunch of other papers. Sometimes people get results that don't replicate the initial finding, but because of really asinine biases in our journals, those never get published. They can't publish those. Those sit and nobody ever deals with them. But then sometimes people get findings that do replicate this, and those get published. So you start to get this growing body of literature all seeming to replicate this finding. And it's only after you've gotten a whole bunch of papers published that seem to replicate the finding that the journals feel, okay, now a paper saying it isn't there, now this is worth publishing because we have all these papers saying it is. So now this becomes something that you can publish, right? So then people come on and publish this that says, oh, this doesn't replicate. And then all those other papers where it didn't replicate, people publish that. And then people say, we thought this thing was a finding, but it really doesn't seem to be true. It doesn't seem to replicate. But they forget about all the studies where it did replicate, right? So now you eventually reach this sort of third period where people start to say, you know what? Sometimes we seem to see this and other times we don't see this. Let's figure out why we see it sometimes and why we don't see it other times and what's happening. And you build this much more complicated and interesting theory around what's going on. And it takes years to get to that point, unfortunately. I mean, I would love to see, I have fantasies about ways of getting around this and fantasies about ways of reorganizing things. And maybe I'll get to talk about that. Maybe I'll allow myself to indulge myself to talk about that a little bit in a minute or two. But the main thing, the main way that you get there is that you have to build on the past stuff and do so very explicitly. The other problem, well, one of the things that you get in a literature where people are always trying to fill research gaps is that you sort of joined a research community in which nobody wants to build on anybody else's work because everybody has to do something for the first time. And when you join that research community, nobody is going to build on your work because you've joined a community and started reading journals and gotten to places and talking to people where the ethos is that we don't build on each other's work. So you put forward your new theory or whatever it is, your new work, and then it gets cited twice. Right? If you want to have your work cited, you need to sort of enmesh yourself in a research community where people do build on each other's work, or your work isn't going to get treated any better than anybody else's work. And then the last one part right here has to do with just the psychology of dealing with reviewers. So the people who are reviewing the paper are overwhelmingly the people who wrote the past papers. That's why they're reviewing your paper, because they wrote the other papers. And there's this constant trope that you hear in these papers, which is so-and-so looked at this, and so-and-so looked at this, and so-and-so looked at this. Unfortunately, there is a massive deficiency in what we've been doing. Well, the person who's reviewing that is the person that you're saying, unfortunately, is deficient and has overlooked all these important things and has failed in all these huge and important ways. They don't like that, right? And so, if we were all pure, that wouldn't matter in terms of your chance of publication. But reviewers are not pure, they are human beings. And when they feel they're being insulted, they don't respond well to that. So it really hurts just at a purely practical level. It hurts the chance. And I see this when, when I read the reviews, there's someone sends in a paper and I read the other reviews, it's like people are fighting. So it's just like, people haven't talked about this. And then you look at this other review, it says like, actually, Professor so-and-so, who happens to be me, talked about this in 5 previous articles. And here they all are. And here's why. And, and you're reading this and you're like, yeah, A, the reviewer's probably right. And B, wouldn't it, there is an alternative. And the alternative is very easy, which is to, instead of seeing the glass as half empty, is to say, this author has talked about these things, and I'm going to, and that was the right thing to talk about at that time, because those were like crucial foundational things. And now that we've established that, I'm going to build on this wonderful work by doing this other thing. And then the other reviewer sees you as advancing their work and making their work more important instead of disrespecting them in their work and making their work seem less important. But it's actually the exact same thing. It's you're still saying, here's something that is new and it's connected to this other work. You're just emphasizing the connection rather than trying to emphasize the lack of connection. The last thing that I see happen in these papers that have this focus on filling the research gap is you get a lot of pointless new terminology. So you get what they call sometimes the old wine in new bottles, right? So you take an old idea and you just put a new term on it. Or you get like tremendous hair splitting where, I've seen this in my area, and I think a lot of it is not caused by this particular mechanism that I'm talking about here, but I think a lot of it is actually in my area caused by this topic of attachment, emotional connection, being something that people have looked at in a lot of different disciplines. So just as an example, people frequently ask me what the difference is between bonding with a brand and brand love. And there is no difference between love and bonding. Bonding was the term used for love in the biological anthropology and biology. And love is the term used in psychology. And people who come from that sort of biological background say bonding. And early, when people were doing the love research, people talked about bonding because it made things sound more scientific. There was sort of a taboo against using the word love because love didn't sound scientific. I'm not making this up. This is totally true. And people, when Rubin was the first person to study, sort of modern psychologist to do serious research on romantic love. And when he did that work, people said to him, like, you can't study that. That's not studyable, right? That's not scientific. It's just beyond science or something like this. So people didn't want to use the word love. And so some people use the word bonding. There's no difference between these things, but you have total replicate. You have like, here's a bunch of studies with love. Here's with bonding, right? And the same thing for other forms of emotional connection. You get that sort of proliferation of terms. That one came from a different place. You still get this proliferation of terms that is very unhelpful. Okay. So what the image I get from these areas where people have a lot of focus on sort of filling a research gap is I see this big landscape with like holes everywhere. Like people keep digging more holes and nobody's building the buildings on top of the holes. And we just get just like this landscape pockmarked with holes as far as the eye can see from this kind of an approach. So I have other things to talk about here, but why don't I pause and let you talk about this and share your thoughts and questions a little bit. You must have some.
So when you
Yeah.
Too many papers. And you say that when you build on past work, you take 1 to 3 past papers and you talk in detail about them. How do you do it without being just like a summary of other articles? Because I don't think this is interesting. I'm not sure how to like those 1 to 3 papers to achieve something interesting to read for a reviewer, something interesting for your research, because I feel like if you only focus on 3 papers, maybe you're going to, I don't know, say the same second time.
Well, because that goes in the literature review, right? So it's okay in the literature review. It's okay to summarize other people's work and not say anything original, because that's what that section of the paper is for, right? So that's fine. But what you then need to do is, having laid out sort of what we know from this past work, then the next step is to say, yes, and the next logical step in this research progression is to investigate X, and I'm going to investigate X. And these other authors haven't necessarily investigated X. So it's increasingly the case that you need, in the better journals, more than one study. And so what often happens if you do this is that you do work which is sort of a conceptual replication, but has some difference with the past work as your first study. And then you build on that and do, several more studies that go further and further away, so that by the time you're done with your, 3 to 12, some of the places like JCR, they're going crazy, like you need 9 studies to it's really insane. But, by the time you're done with all those studies, you definitely have said something that's new. It's just new, but connected to what was done in the past, and part of it's like you and these other people are all on the same team working on a larger project together. That's the sort of mental framework, as opposed to these people failed miserably because they didn't talk about this topic, and I'm going to come and fix it by talking about that topic. That's would be the difference.
Just one question.
Yeah.
You choose
Yeah.
to identify the 3.
Yeah.
I mean, these ones.
Yeah. Right. So and the nice thing about this is that you do have to think more deeply about things, but you don't have to read like everything. Like if you're trying to say that nobody has talked about this before, then you have to read everything, because you got to prove that like nobody has talked about this before. And that becomes very, very difficult. Whereas here, you have to, of course, read more than 3 papers, but you want to pick papers that either the 3 of them are in a line, like you can see how one builds to the next one to the next one, or sometimes you're going to be combining 2 different things. So one of them represents one thing, the other represents the other thing, and here's how you're combining them. And they should be new papers usually they're from the top journals. They don't have to be, and it depends on where you want to publish. It might be from a journal, like if you're publishing in a journal that's a B or B plus journal, you might want to find papers that are in that journal, because people like that. But they should be very good papers, and you should be sincere that you think that what they say is important enough that it's worth everybody's time for you to advance this. I mean, one of the things that this does is it has the opposite sort of implication. So if you're trying to say this has never been talked about before, it forces you to look at smaller and smaller issues. But if you're going to say this is something that lots of people have talked about, but we still don't really know the answer, and now I'm going to help us find the answer. To justify that approach, it has to be on a more important topic, because you have to convince the reviewers that it's worth having the 45th paper on this topic. I think that that's part of the secret, as I say, that is being able to say, we've done this and this and this, but if we want to know the answer to this question, this has been super great. You've done such important work, blah, 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 but we still aren't quite there yet, right? And so here's the next step in getting to wherever there is. And so just as an example of this, and here I'll share my fantasy. I have some thoughts of doing this, and then I think better of it. But I really would love to do this. It's a huge project. But I've been talking to business people who are trying to do various types of green marketing. And what they say is, quite obviously, well, it's more expensive to do it the ecologically correct way, so I have to charge more. And then how do I ever do this? And I think, well, brand love or something like brand love was a perfect answer here, because people tend to really love products and brands that express their deeply held values. And so green products are, a good candidate for expressing people's values. And then once they really love the brand or the product, then they'll be willing to pay more, because that's one of the main outcomes of this. So it fits well, it solves your problem. But there are a whole host of reasons why it's not that simple, why it's really hard to create this kind of commitment or attachment, even to these sort of ethically better brands. First of all, people tend to have a stereotype that they're not going to be as effective, or as whatever they're trying to do, there's not going to be as good in some practical way. I know I have that stereotype. I think about the example, in America, there's a brand called Seventh Generation that creates household cleaners that are good for the environment. I don't ever buy them. Why? Because somewhere in my mind, I believe that something that's good for the environment just isn't going to really clean my house as well as something that's bad for the environment, right? I don't want good for the environment. I want something that's going to kill everything here, right? So, so I don't use that particular product. So you get that kind of assumption that this isn't going to be as good, or it's going to be overpriced. I know that I love wine. I'm shopping for wine. I see the organic or biological produced wines. The first thing that goes through my head is, this is going to be $5 more than it ought to be, right? Whatever the price is. So, there's that sort of second assumption. And then there's the trust that people don't necessarily think that you're really telling the truth, or that what you're doing is really necessarily that important. So that is true. And then I think there's, for some people, even a kind of embarrassment. Like, you don't want to be too overtly virtue signaling, in the same way you don't want to wear perhaps like an item of clothing with an enormous designer logo on it. And it makes you feel like you're sort of showing off. Maybe sometimes I feel like if I were to buy this thing, it would be kind of virtue signaling in too loud of a way, right? So there are all these ways that things, that it seems difficult to do. So the question would be, okay, how do we solve this problem? How do we get, what are you supposed to do if you're sincerely offering some sort of an ecologically better product or brand? What actually should you be doing to develop this? Because you look at another company like Patagonia, and Patagonia is just tremendously successful at this. People love Patagonia. They pay a fortune for it. There's a joke that sometimes people call Patagonia Patagucci, which I think is very appropriate because it's priced like Gucci and it has that same sort of like coolness factor, except it is slightly with a different kind of meaning associated with it. So they're super successful at this. So you know that it can be done, right? There are models that show that it's possible, but how do you do this? So I would love to set up like a website where people we get like sort of crowdsource the question. And you'd have a whole bunch of people who would be like, okay, we want to analyze and interpret data. A bunch of people like, we want to collect data. A bunch of people like, we want to look at the theoretical implications of what the findings are. And you just have some people just like collecting a bunch of data and putting it up on the website. And then it's up there, and anybody who wants to can analyze that and show their results. Anybody who wants to can talk about the results and what are the implications for this. And if you collect data and it doesn't replicate the previous data, then that goes up there too. And if you say, well, X leads to Y, you could have like a voting system where people would vote like, well, we have 40% confidence in that. We have 50%, because we have all these people who've been looking at this. So that would be sort of my fantasy. But you've got this problem that's out there. It's a huge, real problem, right? And we don't know the answer. And meanwhile, people are doing research on stuff that is like completely unimportant, because that's the only thing they can find to do where they feel like they can say nobody's done this before. So you can see why that would make a person a little irritated. So that's part of it. The other part that I'll say that is just as important is that people don't write clearly. And I think the real, I'll let you read the cartoon there with all the acronyms. I think the real problem here comes from what's called the curse of knowledge, which you may be familiar with. And people have actually written papers on like how the curse of knowledge applies in writing and communication. So the curse of knowledge is the fact that when you know something, your brain automatically assumes that everybody else knows it. And the simplest examples with these acronyms. So I see acronyms in papers all the time. I get emails from organizations that say, come to the QPRST conference. And I'm like, what the hell is QPRST? And I open it up, and this whole email, no place does it say what the acronym stands for. Like, they just assume It's like, I have no idea what this organization is. I don't know what you do. And, and you're not telling me. But it's because the person who sent that email, it was so obvious to her or him what that stands for, because they're so used to it that it just never occurred to them that other people would have no idea what that is. And then you have other people who create acronyms it isn't all about acronyms, but they are a pet peeve of mine, who create acronyms because it makes the paper sound, they think it makes it sound more scientific. So I was recently reading a paper that starts off at the beginning, creating like 3 new acronyms that I'd never heard of. And these are for phrases that are commonly used phrases, but they create these acronyms. And throughout the whole paper, they just use the acronyms. But what happens is, as you're reading it, every time you hit that acronym, you have to stop and think, what does that mean? And go back. And there's a big literature on what's called processing fluency. And basically, whether you need to stop and think or whether you can just like read through or think, smoothly. And there's enormous correlations between liking. This is done like literature in advertising. They show people like advertisements better if they're super easy for them to just read. And this certainly applies to our papers as well. But the worst case scenario are people who are trying to sound sophisticated. And I've done a lot of work that's in sort of the more qualitative cultural area. And we're certainly the worst. We're just the worst at this. It's like, okay, we're not going to use really heavy math, but we have to prove we're smart. So let's write in a way that nobody can understand or that only very few people can understand. But it's also easier as a writer to write badly. It takes a lot of time to think, like, how would somebody who isn't familiar with this read this? That takes a lot of time to go through that. And I remember when I used to write with a lot more jargon, that people would sometimes say, provide more examples, which is always a good thing, and don't write with so much jargon. And I remember when I would resist that, but at one point I was like, okay, I'm going to try. I'm going to put in examples and get rid of the jargon. And what I discovered when I did that is A, it was much harder. B, I often didn't know what the hell I was saying. I thought I knew what I was saying. It seemed obvious to me that I knew what I was saying. But when I had to try and spell it out, and especially when I had to find an example, like if you're trying to say this is an important phenomenon, it's an important phenomenon because it happens in the world. You should have no trouble coming up with examples. If you cannot find an example for what you're talking about, that's a terrible sign. That's awful. But I couldn't find it. I realized, like, I don't know. I'm talking about these things. I can't think of a single example of what the hell I'm talking about here, right? And so when I really started working to write with less jargon and with more examples, my ideas made more sense. I had better ideas because I couldn't hide bad ideas behind a lot of jargon. And I do think we're good. We're coming in on time here, but I really do think that I know, because people tell me, that one of the main reasons that my papers get cited so often is because people can read them. People tell me this all the time, that that paper you wrote, but I really love that paper. I could read and understand. I could just sit down and read it and understand what you were saying, without deciphering it. And that, I think, is the overwhelming reason that papers get cited, is because people can read the whole thing. Nobody's going to cite a paper if they stop after the first paragraph. And people stop all the time. So the last thing I'll say on this, we may have different opinions. That I'm sure many of us, I have some negative opinions and worries about artificial intelligence, but like a software like Grammarly, which is based on artificial intelligence for writing, it is great. I'm dyslexic. I cannot spell. I've never been able to spell. It catches everything in a way that spell checkers didn't, because like spell checkers will only catch if the word you've written doesn't exist in their dictionary. But Grammarly will catch if it's the wrong word. If it is an English word, it's just not the right English word, right? It'll catch that. It catches all. it catches everything. It's amazing to me how many mistakes I'm making that I don't see. It's astonishing. And yet when I review papers, it is obvious to me that 95% of the papers I get, nobody has bothered to put them through Grammarly or something, some competitor thereof. And I'm like, why are you doing this? You know, because the literature on processing fluency is really clear here. Like you're making the reviewer stop and like become a line editor. And you have this other alternative that you could just do, and it would take like an hour and you'd be done. So, well, it actually takes more than an hour. It would take like a day for a whole paper and you'd be done, but you'd have a much better paper. So those are my tips and tricks for everybody. You have any thoughts?
Yes. Yeah, I have just one question. No, because I think these 2 points previously and this one is very important because I think the worst part is the literature review. Because I agree that we have to discuss with 3 or 4 papers, but when you have a reviewers, they have their background.
Yes.
And they tell you, okay, but your phenomenon is also very close to this one. Yes. Another literature, you know?
Right.
And you have to read another literature from the reviewer 1 or reviewer 2. So, and the best is when the reviewers are, do agree, but so sometimes it's not so easy to find the right papers.
Right.
To discuss with them, because the reviewers give you more papers to read, etc. Yes. And sometimes you don't see immediately the link, so you read, and so that's why I think this part
is very hard. Yeah, I agree. It is hard. It is hard to do that. But also, just to be clear, I'm not saying that you only discuss 3 papers in your literature review. You want to discuss lots of papers, but you focus on a few. Yeah. So you say like, the literature starts off very much the same way it would with the bad approach, which is you say, people, so-and-so seminal paper, and since then we've seen people talk about this topic and a bunch of things, and this topic and a bunch of things, and this topic and a bunch of things. And what you're doing there is you are showing the reviewers that you read all that stuff, and B, much more importantly, increasing the likelihood that you are going to cite one of or more of the reviewers' papers, because reviewers like it when you cite their papers. And I hate to say this, it makes the process sound a little bit corrupt, but like if reviewers read something and like their papers are in there, then they're like, oh, if this gets published, I'll have more citations. Yes. And they're much more inclined to try and find a way to publish that paper. So you want to have like a whole bunch of different things in the literature review. But then once you get through like a couple paragraphs of that, you focus in on something that you're really going to, and what are you going to make? What's your contribution to the literature? And that's where you narrow down to a smaller number of papers.
And about the examples, yes, that's right, that in the introduction, especially, to have very clear examples of the phenomenon,
yes,
is a good way.
It's a good way. And to start, the other thing I've realized, which is very simple, it feels a bit awkward at first, but it's very simple, is to put the example before the explanation and not after the explanation. So what people tend to do is they go on with these long theoretical explanations that use a lot of jargon. And then after a whole paragraph, they say, and for example, and then they give you the example. But you've had to read that whole paragraph and not knowing what the hell they're talking about the whole time. Whereas if they start off, you start off saying, imagine Sarah. Sarah's shopping for this and she does this. You just provide the scenario as the first thing. Then you say, when Sarah does this, she was blah, blah, blah. Right? And then you provide the jargon then people have the example and they can connect up the example. What I think the problem for the writers, it really does go with the curse of knowledge, is the writer usually has several examples in their mind already. And so for them, it seems obvious as they're writing, and they can't put themselves in the position of the person who can't generate those examples as easily. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think there is a difference between I don't know, which is a hypothetical deductive approach with the quantitative methodology, and when you have CCT research?
On this issue currently, no. I think that there was a time, there are certain areas in the disciplines that CCT draws from, in sociology, in other disciplines, where people value what they call ideographic research. And so they're like, the purpose of this work is to describe a context. And so, and we want to look at marginalized people and situations. So you get a lot of work, which is, I'd like to describe what it's like to be, this particular ethnic group, living in this other kind of culture at this particular time. And so they'll, write a paper about that. And then somebody else will say, okay, but I want to do this other ethnic group in this other culture at this other time, or whatever that might be. And so you get this, a lot of the sort of more descriptive work. And that, I think intellectually, I see the value in that. And I do like the sort of the politics of it also, but I don't think it's a coincidence that that work doesn't get cited. It does not influence much of the world outside of academia. It just sort of stays in academia because it's hard to know what to take away. I guess there's one other thing which I should have put in this, and I think is just as useful as either of these other points. And that is that there are papers that make a lot of little points, and there are papers that make one or two big points, and the papers that get cited are the ones that make one or two big points. That, you can get a paper published if you can say, well, we've shown 9 things, right? And here they are, and cumulatively, the 9 of these things make for a publishable contribution. And journals will publish that in various situations. The problem is the reader can't remember 9 things. And so the reader reads that, and then it's just like a day later, it's all gone. When if you look at the papers that are like the papers that get cited a lot, they all are making like 1 or 2. They've got like one framework, it's fairly simple, or one idea or one insight, and they're just trying to get, and they hammer away at that one thing in different ways. And that's what people can remember. And that's what gets cited, is because people can, can remember what's going on. It's hard to do that though, especially because as you are developing things, it does get complicated, right? Reality is really complicated. So it's, it's hard to find like something that people are going to see as like interesting and new that's like one idea that way. Any other thoughts?
Yes.
Oh,
I want you to know.
okay. Unfortunately, I could have done it in this room, but I can't now because I put the words up there. Now you know what it is. but it's a great experiment. And it really illustrates this. So the way this works, you can do this with your students. So you put people into pairs, and then to half the people, you give them one in each partnership. You give them a little slip of paper, and you say, there is a song here written down, and I want you just not to sing it and no words. You're only going to tap on the table the rhythm of the song. So the song that you give them, like, it could be any song, but Happy Birthday works well because at least in America, everyone knows this song, right? So, you know. And then they go through the song. And then you ask each of them, the partners, to write down, the one who is receiving the song, the listener, can you guess that song? And how certain are you? And then the sender, will the other person be able to guess that song? And how certain are you? And what you find is that the sender is always pretty much 100% sure the other person will guess the song, and the other person is completely clueless and has no idea what song that is. And it's because when you're tapping it out, what you're hearing in your head is happy birthday to you. That's what's going through your head. But the other person is just hearing, and they've got it could be anything. There's millions of songs out there. I don't know what the hell that is. So, and it's a perfect example of what goes on when you're writing too, because you get it and you just assume that this other person's going to get it and they don't get it. Yeah.